Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Speaker, it's a real privilege really to speak on what is a serious bill on a very serious topic that is really going around the world at the moment, and that parliaments, certainly in the common law world, grappling with legislation like this. And I think it does have the capacity to show parliaments, and this one as well, at their best. When we get to hear from, I think so far, universally thoughtful contributions from members, not necessarily entire agreement, but certainly agreement on the main issues and the risks and what it is this sort of legislation should be trying to achieve. Because, like my colleague Amy Adams, I would say this should be, and I think has the capacity to be so far, certainly Labour, National and other parties, a bipartisan issue where reasonable people can come together and work through the issues constructively to find common ground. I accept, I think, some of the things that David Shearer has said, that there is this effectively balancing between the risks and the need for protection and security in New Zealand, vis-a-vis also that those undeniable and fundamental rights of privacy and freedom, and the freedoms that we as New Zealanders, I think, again, as I think Amy Adams said, sometimes do take for granted, but that rights, freedoms that should be cherished. It's a sort of a balance again, or an argument again between not being complacent about the very real risks, and in this country, whilst not at the level of risks in some other countries, such as the United Kingdom, which I think has very recently raised their threat profile again, but nevertheless risks here, not being complacent about those, against also not having an over-the-top, burdensome approach where there is no freedom to do anything because we're tying everything up. Well, we are, of course, in this bill very far from that. We have a targeted approach to identified risks. And I say, for example, Mr. Speaker, in my portfolio of transport, some have called for universal screening really at all airports in New Zealand. In my view, whilst we shouldn't be complacent about the risks around all airports in New Zealand, and while in a sense we are always reviewing airport security, we wouldn't want to act disproportionately. We wouldn't want to have an untargeted approach where the risk clearly does not justify it and where it's out of proportion to the threats. And this bill, I think, is not in that category. As I've said, really, it is one where we are acting as a country in a targeted fashion to identified risks to keep New Zealanders safe. I didn't agree with David Shearer in his comments around, why now? Why does this have to be passed before the end of the year? And I'd say quite simply to David Shearer and reiterate what the attorney has said, that as the IRA once said, we only have to be lucky once. And that's not to say, Mr. Goff, that we should be alarmist. That's not to say we should be anything other than realistic about the threats that there are. But I do think it means that where we have had a review, where we are in a position to act, that we should, and that is what we're doing, and that is, I think, strong enough reason to ensure that we do work on this expeditiously. And there will be time enough, actually, to take on board the legitimate concerns, I think, that, for example, David Shearer has raised. and to work through those in select committee. I know the attorney is famously a reasonable man who will, and has, in a discussion just had with him, been listening to some of the critique on the technical parts of the bill, and I've no doubt there is the capacity for movement on some of that to ensure that this is the best law that it can be for New Zealand and New Zealanders. Of course, this bill does focus on our ability to manage the threats posed by foreign terrorist fighters. It's an issue, the issue of foreign terrorist fighters, that's fast evolving as a threat for New Zealand as well as other countries, and currently, I think we all know now, really the top priority for our SIS. The objectives of this bill are to counter the threats posed by foreign terrorist fighters by providing statutory powers to firstly investigate and monitor suspected and returning foreign terrorist fighters and other violent extremists, and secondly to restrict and disrupt the ability of suspected foreign terrorist fighters to travel to conflict zones. I think this government, there's no question, and I believe for the most part this Parliament takes national security and the obligations around that very seriously indeed. We're no longer, I think, the benign environment in terms of threats that many people think that we are, and we do have as a Parliament as well as a government an obligation to ensure New Zealanders are safe here at home and abroad, bearing in mind my comments about doing that in the most targeted, proportionate way that we can. We do not want to see as a country New Zealand or New Zealanders as the target or source of any sort of violent extremism. Parliament has to and is in this bill taking responsible, proportionate steps in the short term to deal with the immediate threat to our national security. It's the rapidly changing security environment that really is driving the legislative changes. And as I've already said, the bill is tightly focused to address the known and the current risks ahead of a more comprehensive review of the core New Zealand intelligence community next year. And of course it's that review and putting in place the recommendations that will come from it that mandate the 2018 sunset clause of this bill. Of course, if we could have the review conclude and the changes before then, well, that date could move as well. But we are focused, Mr. Speaker, on responsibly addressing the risks that the rapid rise of ISIL present to us locally, regionally, and we know not through this bill necessarily, but through other efforts, humanitarian, military and so on, abroad as well. I already echo the comments of David Shearer about the rise of ISIL, and here we've got a situation where there are concerns that there are New Zealanders who are currently offshore fighting, interested in travelling for the purposes of fighting, have returned from fighting, radicalising others and becoming radicalised themselves. That sort of threat, whilst not to be overdone, is real and present and justifies the response in this bill. I know, Mr. Speaker, whilst it's a relatively brief period in Select Committee, that all members there will give it their diligent and thoughtful minds on these issues, and that at the end of it we will have a bill that makes New Zealand a more safe country for New Zealanders.
Mr. Speaker.
Called Dr. Kennedy Graham.